So let's talk about cutoff, because this is something I don't think companies think about, especially smaller companies. I think most bigger companies have got this figured out. But smaller companies don't necessarily think about cutoff and how to use it to their advantage. There's an opportunity to extend order times. There's an opportunity to offer different shipping methods. So tell me a little bit about cutoff date and what you see.
Well, cutoff date, cutoff time is the
Yeah, time.
time
Yeah. Yep.
that the last order can be packed out and tendered to the carrier.
Yeah.
And so depending on where your FC is, and when you can get a pickup, that cutoff time can either work for you or against you, in terms of the amount of time, the total amount of time necessary from when you told the customer. Even if you're still saying usually ships in, which is why a lot of companies default to 1 to 2 days,
Hmm.
which actually doesn't work on weekends. If you order Friday and you're after cutoff, it might be 3 days before it ships. So cutoff is really critical in terms of thinking about it. One is part of uh, how can I serve the customer best in terms of getting it to them the fastest. But the other way to think about it, particularly in a multi-node network, is where's the latest pickup and cutoff that I have in my network, and how can I use that to my advantage to serve customers by shipping as late as humanly possible and still getting it to that customer. And there's a lot of challenges with that. Like a lot of companies will, or a lot of executives or business people will say, well, why can't you just take your 2 p.m. West Coast cutoff and move it to 5 p.m.
Yeah.
Like, well, and a lot of time the answer is, well, sure, we can do that, and we can even have the UPS come or the carrier come and pick up the all of the cargo, but they won't inject it until 9 a.m. the next morning too. So there's a lot of complexity in that. So it's not quite as easy as just saying, hey, when does the last drop? You have to again understand in your network when all those things are occurring so that you can optimize. And I highly recommend to any company, particularly companies in 3PLs, if you don't squawk loud enough, they just give you what they give you. But if you understand when all of those touch points can occur, you can actually negotiate with that 3PL, because nobody else is, or very few other companies are, to actually benefit you and your customers.
And this is where injection really started to pick up, with actual retailers doing their own injection into carrier networks, is because of just this, right? A carrier couldn't do a pickup time or a cutoff time at 9 p.m. It's kind of unusual for a big carrier to do a 9 p.m. Pickup at an FC. So a 7 p.m. cutoff time, while it looks good on paper, isn't necessarily benefiting anyone. And that's where a lot of this injection stuff started to happen, because if you are running your own trucks and your cutoff is at 7 and you're loading out your truck at 9 p.m., you can drive that truck to an injection point where maybe your carrier would have to get, isn't offering that service at this time. And then I think the other piece to this as well is whether or not you're shipping air versus ground versus, expedited. It depends on what kind of speed you're trying to accomplish as well. And this goes back to our conversation about running a super efficient FC, because when you get to scale, you are managing, these are ground packages, they can wait. These are 2-day packages, they can't wait. These are next day packages, these have to go first. And if you're not running a really clean FC and you're exceeding promise or these other things that show excess in your network, then you're not optimizing each one of those at that granular level that now we're getting down to ship speeds, which again goes back to promise to the customer, which is not something that we're seeing happen on a regular basis.
Mhm. Well, and in a 3PL setting, you're competing with other merchants in that warehouse for those carrier drops.
Yeah.
And so your ability to be the most efficient and manage that, ensures that the customer promise matches more tightly, versus other merchants who may not be doing that at all. But remember, your battle royale inside of that fulfillment center for that carrier drop. And if you're not taking advantage of the data that you have and the information you have to understand that, manage it daily, do everything you can to optimize it, you're at the whim of if somebody else, if you're Sims and you have fly fishing products and you're in the same fulfillment center as drugstore.com, which doesn't exist anymore, unfortunately, but those items are likely to get prioritized, especially right now, because the volumes are just going to go through the roof.
Yep.
So, and 3PLs don't necessarily have the ability to flex as fast as maybe your own internal workforce, certainly not as fast as Amazon, right? And so when storms come through and affect those cutoff times, you need to be as ready and optimized as you possibly can.
Yeah. All right. So just to recap, because we talked a lot about cutoff time. Cutoff time for cutoff time's sake, just to make an FC look good or to make a transportation manager look like they're, really taking the carrier to the mat. Doesn't really matter if it isn't actively then flowing. The customer wants to know, if I make this order today, when are you going to promise me that I'm going to get it?
And a lot of the business leaders, the people that run the e-commerce groups, basically wash their hands of the operational components and just trust, and this isn't nefarious, but they trust their operational counterparts to do the right thing. Well, those metrics are yours. You own them because you own the experience and you own the customer.
It's a really good point. And again, that is something that I see a lot, is that ops has their ops meeting. Unfortunately, they're typically doing it in a way that's very backward looking. So monthly ops meetings versus weekly and daily. I actually worked with a company that I was like, look, you got to do weekly meetings. Like at a minimum, you should be having weekly meetings. This is what they told me. That's such a waste of time. Like, we do it monthly. We don't have time to have a meeting every week. I'm like, you don't not have time to have a meeting every week. Like, you have to have a meeting every week. But yes, a lot of companies, ops is over here. They're typically an expense center. So they're focused on saving money. And they are not, and in reverse, the ops people aren't typically thinking about the customer, unfortunately, right? They're thinking about their individual inside metrics because they're not thinking about the customer. And then the business side is kind of like, I don't know why my customers are unhappy. I don't know why my loyalty is down. I don't know why acquisition is struggling. I don't know why anything, and they're perplexed. And you're like, well, if you have one meeting with your ops team, I think you might start to understand what's going on, because you're not getting your products there on time. You're canceling orders. You're doing all these other things, but everyone just kind of wants to stick their head in their respective sandboxes. And that is something that you and I saw at Amazon, which was the powerful WBR, which was the Worldwide Business Review meeting that happened on a weekly basis, right? With the SVPs. And, back in the day when you and I were there, like Bezos attended, right? This was something that all of the big leaders got in a room and looked at the business holistically. Do you want to add to that?
Yeah, that was the opportunity for the transparency, the ownership, and the customer centricity. Without it, everybody operates in a silo, and they are saying, well, my numbers look good. Well, your numbers may look okay for operations team, but customer service contacts have gone way up on missed promise, right? And so, like, not being able to see all those things, and it's hard. Like, it's hard enough to get individual teams to get together and really like do weekly reviews or even daily reviews, but and then broadening that out.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, if you're not finding ways to connect all of the look backs like you were talking about earlier,
Mm-hmm.
and then using that information to drive the whole wheel,
Yes,
then you're missing a huge opportunity, right? And so again, there's baby steps to all of this.
mm-hmm.
But if you're not taking the information you have, and if you're not like, if the company isn't actively looking at that information and understanding how critical the whole flywheel is,
Yes,
then you're really, you're really not doing the customer a service. And, customers reward companies that take that view, that are doing as much as they can to holistically understand the whole experience, and give them not only the right promise date, but when things go wrong, because they always go wrong, like avenues to fix those issues. But again, to me, it comes back to a point of ownership, which is the business leadership team, that has to anchor all of those things together in a meaningful way.
Yeah, agreed. So let's just recap before we sign off today. What are some of the baby steps that companies can take to start working towards a promise date, right? So one of the first things is you need to get real-time data from your carriers, right?
Mm-hmm. Or even, take a dump, get a data dump every night.
Yeah. Okay. So yeah, at worst, okay, fair. Yeah. Let's start with baby steps. Get a data dump every night. Even if that's in an Excel spreadsheet, get a data dump every night. Start looking at the data and start comparing, when did it ship? When did we expect it to arrive? And then what should we start promising? So based on those two data points, right? And breaking it down, and you can break it down, you can start by breaking it down by zone. Especially if you only have 1 to 2 FCs, it's fairly easy to do, is start breaking that down by zone. You don't have to jump into zip codes right off the bat. And then once you start to get some confidence in how your carriers are performing by zone, then you can start to back into promise dates to your customer. Do you think that's a good approach?
Yeah, absolutely. So if you take all that information and then you take some very simple information, and you can even start with the information you may or may not trust it, but it's information you have, which is, I know I have a cutoff date at this time, a cutoff time in my FC. I know that about this many packages per day. Your order distribution tends to be pretty steady and looks kind of similar week on week. But if you're not actually charting that, you should be, because then you can just take some of this very simple information and say, here's the real-time information from my carrier, which is kind of a blind spot. Here's the information I can get internally, even if it's coarse grained and aggregated, and you can start adding that up and then sorting it by zone to say, this zone is seeing 92% of the time is seeing X. This zone is 75%. Like, if I'm going to make a promise, I better pad it or do something, right? But you can start with that information, and it's not that hard.
Yeah. And that's how Amazon started. We started with kind of padding, right? We were like, it's like 80% getting there within 2 days. We're going to pad it to 3 until we can get more and more precision and drive it. So yeah. So I think that's another thing that companies, the companies that I've worked with, and I've heard this so many times, and it gives me kind of a facial tick, where companies are like, we're going to be like Amazon, and we're going to start tomorrow. And what companies don't understand is that what you see Amazon doing today, 2-day promise, 1-day promise, has been 10, 15 years in the making. Like, this has been a slow process of continuing to just constantly grinding away at the carriers, at the FCs, and getting more and more and more efficient. It's not something that happens overnight.
No, that's for sure.
Yeah. Yeah.
But it starts the first step on the journey is making sure you have the data. To me, the first step of the journey is collecting the data. Then critically, doing something with it.
Yes.
Take action with the data, and then make it transparent. These things aren't that hard to do. You just need to do them.
Yeah.
Right? Collect a little data, start using it, start acting on it on a daily basis, and then share it. Even if people are yawning, share it, because when it looks bad, maybe it looks great right now, but the day it looks bad, maybe somebody's going to take some interest and say, hey, what happened, right? And that's what you want. Mm-hmm. You're not trying to draw attention to yourself in a negative way. You're trying to draw everybody's attention to customer